Hello, I would like to introduce a colleague of mine, Jill Kramer, who is an expert on the science of reading, and that's what today's interview and talk is going to be about. Jill is a colleague on a project that we've been working on for a number of years. And Jill, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, so my name is Jill Kramer. I am from New Zealand. You may notice an accent, but I have lived my adult life in the States. I was a teacher for many, many, many years with Dublin City Schools. Then I transitioned into an administrator role. I have a master's in TESOL, a master's in educational leadership. And the science of reading is actually a very personal thing for me because as a teacher, I could see my students were not learning to read in the ways that were being used at the time. And so I just totally immersed myself into the science of reading. And, um, and so I really know and see the benefits of this. Okay, let's
Well,
get
welcome.
started.
So, Jill, what is actually the science of reading?
Yeah, sometimes the term is used rather loosely, but before we start on what is the science of reading, first of all, we just have to look at a quick look at some data and some history. So there is every 2 years, there's a test of reading done across the United States. And it's called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And quite honestly, American kids have scored dismally. So whatever we've been doing for the last 20, 30 years has not been working. As you can see, only 35% of fourth graders were proficient or above, and only 31% of eighth graders. And in Ohio, these figures also bear out when we look at our test scores from Ohio. So the approaches to reading have really changed over the years. So a long time ago, when I was a child, we did have a very strong phonics instruction. However, then through some sort of faulty research, there was a swing to this whole language approach, whole word approach, which then morphed into balanced literacy. And balanced literacy has really been the most influential approach for the last, 20, 30, 40 years or longer. However, now the pendulum is swinging the other way to an approach called the structured literacy approach, which is based on the science of reading. So if you would like to know more about this, there are resources, but another easy way is to listen to a podcast called Sold a Story by Emily Hanford, or read any of her materials. That'll help you learn in a nutshell, and then there's a lot more resources out there. So while we were teaching balanced literacy, the National Reading Panel came out with their research in 2000. It was Congress had commissioned it, and they looked at 2 decades of research, and they said all students need phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension strategies. So we have known that these are we call them the 5 pillars of reading. We have known this, but they weren't happening. So it's taken a while, but finally in the 2000 teens, the term science of reading became very popular. And the science of reading is basically the science. And it is a body of knowledge derived from decades of research in all sorts of sciences: developmental psychology, educational psychology, cognitive science, and cognitive neuroscience. And what has been really the game changer is the ability to look into our brains and see what happens in the brain when we're learning to read. And one of the resources I shared with Dr. Crystal is on that very thing: what happens in the brain? And that has given us a really good look so that we now know how children learn to read. And we call it settled science, in that this science has been repeated over and over again in English and Spanish and French, etc., especially alphabetic languages. And we know that this is true, the way that we learn to read. And as a result of that, there are ways that we have to teach reading. But the science of reading is the science of how we learn to read, and therefore what the implications then for actually reading. So the human brain is wired for speech. Any child will learn to speak unless there's a disability. They'll learn to speak in whatever language they're surrounded in. However, reading is not a natural act. It's not something that children pick up. There are a few few kids who do seem to pick up reading very easily. But for the most part, it's something that has to be taught very explicitly, because what we're really doing is rewiring the brain. The brain has to make connections between these squiggly things on a page called letters and over the other side of the brain, the speech sounds. So they have to learn that that B sound in the word book is actually the stick with the little ball. So we are actually rewiring the brain when we're teaching kids how to read. And now through those brain scans that we talked about, you can actually see the neurons, the neural pathways being developed. So we now know how kids learn to read. And we also know that students really need and can definitely benefit from instruction that is explicit, is systematic, and sequential. Explicit meaning we're telling the kids exactly what we want them to know, rather than discovery, which takes time and some kids unfortunately don't discover. It's systematic. We do it systematically and we do it sequentially. So we're going to start with the consonants, for example, or the short vowels. And we do this now through the approach of structured literacy. So the balanced literacy approach is what has been holding sway, been most influential, was a rather haphazard approach to phonemic awareness. Phonics may have been taught, but they were typically very much mini lessons and they didn't follow a scope or sequence. So one day we were working on short vowels, the next day, oops, we're doing the long vowels, the next day we're doing blends, and it was just all over the place. And I could just see kids not making these connections. There was rote memorization of high frequency words, leveled text. And leveled text means there would be sentences for kindergartners like, I can see the elephant. Elephant is such a hard word for a kindergartner because the PH makes an F sound, it's multisyllabic. So what happened was it encouraged guessing. Children couldn't read the word elephant, so they looked at the photo, the picture, oh, they saw the elephant. But the problem was the sentence could have said, I can see the rabbit. They look at the picture and they say bunny. But the word was not bunny, it was rabbit. So it encouraged guessing, and guessing was okay because the focus was on the meaning, not the text. There was also the idea that you get better at something by doing it. You get better at playing tennis by doing it. So they felt like, well, the more you read, the better you'll get. But actually, for some kids, not. They just got into some bad habits that never got away from. So they wanted children to love to read, and we all want children to love to read. That's not in the question, but how we get to that is a little bit different. Under structured literacy, we are now using this very explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction. So we are working, as I mentioned, with consonants and short vowels, etc., with both phonemic awareness and phonics. For high frequency words, we are teaching them now by their phonetic patterns, because many of those words are actually quite decodable, and that helps the kids learn them rather than having to just memorize them as a word. We use decodable text that is aligned to whatever the phonics pattern. So if they are just learning words like cat, sat, mat, fat, rat, they can start reading a sentence in a book, the fat cat sat on the mat. Sounds boring, but you know what? The kids read a sentence, and I have seen their eyes light up when they realized they read a sentence and they understood it. So that's how you get better at reading, is building that confidence. If a child misreads a word, for example, they said, I can see the bunny, we would have them go back and see that this word starts with an R. What sound does that make? And then have them work through that word. And we know now that children get better at reading by learning and practicing the code, the phonics code. That's how they get better. And then they love reading because it's not hard for them. For so many children, reading was so hard that they hated reading because they had never been explicitly taught the code. So the whole point of teaching them to read is to teach them to read, then they will love reading. So the big shift has been away from the 3 Qs, and you may have heard about this, the 3Q method. So under balanced literacy, we would say to the kids, oh, just look at the picture. And of course, they would see the bunny instead of the rabbit. Or we might say, what word would fit there? The sentence would say, I can see a bunny, but they would read, I can see the bunny. Well, it fits. Is it okay? No, it's not actually what's there. And then we would sometimes say, well, look at the first letter. What does it start with? So they would say, I love my mom. But the word actually said mother. So we want them to be looking at the word, not just taking that first letter. So under structured literacy, we encourage kids to sound it out, to touch and say it, to tap the sounds out. So if they did try to say mom instead of mother, we would have them go through all the letters. And we use those decodable books. We also thought under whole language and balanced literacy that words were learned as a whole, that you just learned that word. Because as a good reader, when you're reading, you are not sounding out words. Every time you see the word cat, you don't have to go at cat. You just know it. So it looked like we were reading words as a whole, as a unit. And so we did all this work with word shapes with kids. But we now know that's not true. We learn words by decoding. So sometime when you were 5 or 6, 7 years old, you decoded words, either by yourself or with your teacher's help. And then your brain made that neural pathway so that those words were orthographically mapped, C-A-T. That became part of your sight word, which we call an orthographic lexicon. I'll mention that later. And the amazing thing is our brains are so amazing that you will always remember a word that you've learned how to read. Sometimes you might forget the actual word, how to say it, but when you see it in print, maybe a word you haven't seen for 10 years, you'll still know that word. You can read that word. Our brains are really amazing. So Ohio has a plan to raise literacy achievement. You may be aware of this if you're working in schools. And Ohio has adopted the science of reading approach. It's actually a legal requirement in our schools. And if you haven't read it, please feel free to go onto the Department of Education and Workforce's website and find this plan. It's quite good. Ohio also has the dyslexia supports that you might be aware of that Governor DeWine signed into law in 2021. Then there was a dyslexia committee set up. A guidebook was written. Students now in the lower grades have to be screened every year for dyslexia or dyslexic tendencies. And then they have to be offered tier 2 and tier 3 type of instruction, but we'll talk about those later. So these are all things that have been working together in our state of Ohio to provide extra support for kids. Okay.
Jill, can you explain the simple view of reading, please?
Yes, so the simple view of reading, sometimes you'll see it as SVR, is actually it's a reading model, almost like an infographic that can help us understand how students read. And this came out actually in a long time ago, 1986. Goff and Tunma came out with this model. And the Ohio Department of Education has adopted it. And I just took this from their website. Unfortunately, I did cut off the P in the word phonics, but you'll know what I'm talking about. So their model is seemingly simple, but it's actually kind of complex. So there are two facets of reading. One is word recognition. That means you can read or decode the words. So that means you've got your phonemic awareness, you've got your phonics, and you know those sight words. We've sort of changed some of our understanding of those. But the other part is you have to have the language comprehension. You have to know what you're reading. You have to be, the vocabulary, have the background knowledge, have the knowledge of how books work. And you need both to have reading comprehension. So then you might think, well, why is there a multiplication sign and not an addition sign? Because surely it would be word recognition plus language comprehension equals. But here's the thing. If you think about anything multiplied by 0, the answer is
0.
Yeah. So my daughter is a medical researcher. She sent me an abstract the other day on she just published finally. She sent me an abstract on her medical research. I could actually read the abstract. I mean, I could decode it. I had no idea what it was about because I didn't know the medical vocabulary. I didn't know the background knowledge. I picked up a little bit. It was about babies, and then they would get this blood test, but I couldn't figure it out. She had to give me the explanation in simple terms. So I had word recognition. Then I think about my own little granddaughter who's just started kindergarten. She has great language comprehension. This little girl, 5 years old, has a great vocabulary. I can talk to her about lots of different things. I can read Charlotte's Web to her and she understands it. However, if I gave her Charlotte's Web, she couldn't read it because she's just starting kindergarten. She's just learning those simple words. So anything multiplied by 0 is 0. So when I was reading my daughter's abstract, my reading comprehension was 0. When my granddaughter was presented with Charlotte's Web, her reading comprehension was 0. So we have to have both parts of the simple view of reading. So there's a lot more in it than we'll talk about today. Okay.
The reading rope from Dr. Hollis Scarborough is widely used. Can you help us understand this work, please?
Yes, so the reading rope is very influential, and I really encourage all of you to dive into it, print it out, have it close. Dr. Scarborough published this back in 2001, but it's only been about the last 6-7 years that it's become so popular. It's an infographic. It's not, it's a way to help us understand like the simple view of reading. She was actually an educational psychologist and literacy expert, and she developed the rope initially to help parents understand how children learn. So when we look at this, we can see that it kind of breaks things down further than the simple view of reading, but it's the same idea. You've got your sort of top down and bottom up. So starting at the bottom, you've got your word recognition, the decoding skills, the ability to, as we say, like lift the words off the page. So our phonological awareness of sound, our understanding of phonics, decoding as phonics, and sight word knowledge. But at the same time, students need the language comprehension that we just talked about. So each of these little ropes is a strand. And in our early years in elementary K1 and 2, we are really working here with both word recognition and language comprehension at the same time, with the goal that by 3rd grade, students should be fairly skilled readers, that they have become increasingly automatic and increasingly strategic and develop that fluency that comes together. And Dr. Scarborough has said, when I've seen her speaking, that if there's a weakness in any one strand, it can disrupt the whole reading process. So we have to have all of these strands really, really strong. So in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, yes, we are focusing a lot on word recognition. We are doing all that decoding, that basic phonics, but at the same time, of course, we're building language comprehension. Once you've learned to decode by 3rd grade, you don't do that again. That's done. You'll be doing perhaps some other work with multisyllabic words we'll talk about, but it's sort of a one-time thing. Once you've done it, you've done it. In English, it's a very opaque language. It does take a little longer.
Is the science of reading an instructional approach?
Yeah, a lot of people use that term to indicate that it is an instructional approach. People say, oh, I teach the science of reading, or, oh, my curriculum is science of reading. But actually, it's a bit of a misnomer. The science of reading is the science, like what we have learned from science. There's a science of reading, there's sort of a science of teaching reading, and then there's the art of teaching reading. But the science of reading is the knowledge that we have now of how we learn to read and what implications that has for reading. And as I mentioned earlier, we've now moved to this structured literacy. So the approach is called structured literacy. That's our instructional approach, but it's based on the science of reading. And we've even in the last 5 years made changes and different things. So we're still learning about how to do this the best, but we're doing the best that we can with the knowledge that we have. You'll often see curriculum that is called science of reading curriculum. There is actually no science of reading curriculum. Science of reading is just the science, but many publishers now will stamp science of reading on it, but just be a little skeptical. The Ohio Department of Education has a list of approved curriculum that have to be used in Ohio, and other states also do the same thing if you're outside of Ohio. So you want to make sure that that curriculum is actually aligned to the science of reading. But publishers have jumped aboard. There are a lot of really good ones out there now that are great. So when you're looking at curriculum and you're thinking about science of reading, you have to think, does it include a phonemic awareness of sounds, phonics, the letters that spell our words, reading connected text. So once you can read individual words, can you read text that's all connected into a story? But do you also have that language development and that vocabulary instruction, and then morphology, which we'll talk about briefly.
How does Yeah, it's okay. How does the structured literacy look in a K-2 classroom?
Yes. So in the kindergarten classroom, there really is a big focus on phonemic awareness and the beginning phonics. That will be a major part of what kindergarten teachers do. But also at the same time, they're also doing that rich oral language development. They're building the kids' knowledge. They're using decodable text for their reading, but at the same time, they're reading aloud great stories to the kids. They're learning science, they're learning social studies. So they're learning about things that they can't yet read about themselves, while at the same time, they're learning to read at their instructional level. In first grade, there's still phonemic awareness used. Of course, now you're moving into things like the long vowels and all those variant vowels and all those odd words that we have in English. And they're learning more and more about those spelling patterns. But at the same time, again, the teachers are also developing that oral language development, that vocabulary, that background knowledge that they need. By second grade, the kids are moving on to some of the higher level phonics. They've shifted now from the decodable text, which they used in K1, more to either level text or trade books. You know, by second grade, a lot of the kids are reading Magic Treehouse, and so now they're able to read those trade books. But the teacher still continues with a lot of oral language. There's still lots of good read alouds, building that knowledge and vocabulary that maybe they can't read those big words yet, but they can hear them. And throughout all of this, instruction continues to be explicit, systematic, and sequential. So just what is phonemic awareness? I've used this term several times. Let me just quickly break it down for you. So a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound. And English has 26 letters, as you know, but those 26 letters have to spell 44 phonemes, 44 sounds that we have in English. And of those 44, 18 of those are vowel phonemes. Some languages like Spanish are almost a one-to-one correspondence. They only have 23 phonemes. So you can see in English, it's a lot harder. Students will need a lot longer to learn English than they would to learn Spanish or Finnish, for example. And phonemic awareness is work that is done orally. So if you know the word cat, you learn as a child that cat is made up of 3 separate sounds. K, a, t. So this is work we do orally with the kids. We get them to tap it out. We get them sometimes to do k, a, t, so that they can hear that there are 3 sounds. So eventually they're going to be able to connect that to actual letters. But at first we just want them to hear. We want them to hear what's the first sound in words. So here are our 44 phonemes in English. Even if you're not an English teacher or an ESL type person, you still kind of want to know some of these because these are sounds that are going to be in academic words, whatever the content is that you're teaching. If you are helping students learn to sound out words, you just want to make sure when you say a consonant, don't add a vowel sound. Like, for example, if you're teaching a word that starts with B, make sure that if you're helping the students sound it out, that you just go B. Don't go ba, just B, B. Or M is not ba, ma. So sometimes people add another sound. So just keep this pure sound of that consonant. So phonological awareness is the ability to understand that there are syllables in words, that there are words that start with the same letter, like the lazy, lion, leaped, onset and rhyme, k, at, at. It's also being able to blend. If I give you a k, at, you can blend that into the word cat. Or I can say man, and you can figure out that that's a. So these are little things that a lot of kids enter school already knowing. Some kids will learn that in school, but that is some of the work that we do. Now, the more advanced phoneme work doesn't have to happen before we start words. That can be happening at the same time. But this is like, when you think about it, a little kid comes to school and they can understand a whole story, Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. They have this big stream of speech, but we now have to help them realize that those words, and those words are made up of sound. So we have to bring them all the way down to that sound level, and then we can connect it to letters. So one thing that you'll see teachers do is use these boxes called sound boxes or Elconian boxes, using little tokens or bits of paper, and we have the kids say the word hat, and then we have them push the paper up, at, so that they can hear that there are 3 sounds. So that would be something you'd see in a kindergarten classroom. Okay, now I have an activity for your students, Dr. Crystal. Okay, so say the word cup and tell me how many phonemes do you hear in the word cup?
Cup, up, 3.
3. Good. Did everyone get it right? I hope so. Okay, next one, horse. What do you think, Dr. Crystal?
Horse, 4, 4.
It's a bit tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, that's hard.
Or, because that's an R-controlled vowel, s, h, or s, horse, and then you've got that silent E at the end.
Right.
Okay, next one. This could be a little tricky if a kid didn't know what you were talking about, but the word is sleep. Sleep.
Sleep. 4.
Yes. S-l-e. The E is spelled, of course, with 2 E's because it's a long vowel. Fridge. Fridge.
Fridge. Oh, that's a hard one. I'm going to guess 5, but I'm not sure.
4.
4.
Close enough. 4, yeah.
Okay.
Fridge. Even though we spell it D-G.
Right, right.
Yeah. So it's harder than you think sometimes. Okay, so now quickly, just to make sure we all know what's meant by phonics. So we talked about phonological awareness, the phonemic awareness, the top part of that hourglass. Now we're talking about the bottom part, and this is Carol Tolman's infographic here. So this is where students, now they're hearing the sounds, now they have to connect them to the letters. Remember, 44 sounds, only 26 letters. So the problem is that some of our sounds are spelled with more than one letter. Anyway, so this is what we call graphemes are what we call our letters that represent. We don't say letters say sounds, like often I know as a teacher will say, well, B says B, but actually the letter B represents the sound B. Digraphs, 2 letters that make one sound, like sh. Trigraph, 1 sound, ch. Vowel team, 2 vowels that make usually a long sound, a long vowel sound like O. Blends like SL and sleep, actually we say both, sl, so that's different than a digraph. Word family, so if you know how to spell cat, you can pretty much figure out mat, sat, rat, etc. Pat. Syllables, morphemes we'll talk about, smallest unit of meaning, and etymology is the origin of words. And that's work we do with our older students, because if they know where a word comes from, it helps them to understand why it's spelled that way. For example, we might teach the children that a word like let, L-E-T, let. But then the kids see a word like ballet, but wouldn't that be ballet? But if you know that ballet is from the French language and they do not pronounce the final consonant, then that helps students learn that. And kids actually are fascinated by that. So now phonics is bringing those sounds to letters. So we have to help students make this connection. And this is something that has to be taught explicitly. So it's that sound symbol correspondence where a phoneme is represented by anything from 1 to 4 graphemes or letters. And now this is a visual process and it has to be taught. So just for fun, I'm going to go through these quickly. Cat, you can see that it has 3 phonemes and 3 letters, right? But now look at the word shoe. Okay, Dr. Crystal, how many phonemes do you hear? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Ask me again.
Oh, how many sounds or phonemes do you hear in the word shoe?
Shoe. 2.
Very good. 2 phonemes, but 4 letters. So this is what we do. I won't make you do all of them, Dr. Crystal, but chimp, we've got CH is a
Ch.
if.
And so that's 4. Yeah.
4. Now try this one. Bright.
I. Four.
Right, four phonemes. But how do we spell the I sound in this word?
How do we spell it?
Yeah.
IGH.
Yeah, so here we have three letters that make the sound long I sound. So,
Right.
kids have to be taught this. This does not come naturally to any child. A few kids will pick it up quickly, but what about this one?
Three.
Yeah, three. And how do we make the long O sound?
OW.
Yeah, so English has so many of these different spelling things that just have to be taught. And you think, oh, it's about impossible, but actually, English is about 50% decodable. And a lot of the other words are partly decodable. So it really comes down to just 4 or 5% of words are totally not decodable and have to be taught.
Jill,
But
could I ask you a question? I'm thinking in the upper grades, let's some of the science classes, yeah, biology, any of them, the students are learning long words that they'd have to decode. Um, that must be really difficult in
it
the
is, in fact,
process.
yes, we're going to talk about that shortly because they are
Okay.
reading these multisyllabic academic words. But if they can't read the simple one-syllable words, they won't be able to tackle these big ones. And that's kind of what I'm getting to here in the end. So
Okay. Thank
keep
you.
going. Yeah. So back to the idea of how we learn to read. The words that you can read effortlessly, pick up a piece of paper and just look at it. You can read it probably effortlessly. These are called your orthographic lexicon. And I think of it like you've got this file cabinet in your head, and all these words are in there because you, at some point, you decoded them and you orthographically mapped those. And all you needed was 1 to 5 exposures. A typically developing reader needed 1 to 5 exposures of a word, and you learned it. Some kids will need more. So just think about how many words do you think an adult would know how to read? Do you want to make a guess, Dr. Crystal?
Oh my gosh. It's like I'm just thinking myself, but a million, I really, it's just one of those numbers I just can't even imagine.
Well, you're kind of right in a million because there are kind of a million words in English if you count every different variation of a word,
Got it. Okay.
like um, run. Oh, that's not a good example, but like, liked, liking, but basically up to 70,000 words. So in general conversation, around 30,000 words we use on a regular basis. More highly educated people in specialized fields will know about 70,000. There
Wow.
is no way that your brain can remember 70,000 words. So this ability to decode is what helps us learn all these words. You just can't keep all of those words in your head. Most of those words were not taught to you. Your teachers taught you the basic phonics. And then as you were progressing through elementary school, you saw a new word and you knew how to read it because you had the phonics knowledge. So there are new words that come into our language at all times. For example, the word COVID. We didn't know that word in 2019. And now, of course, it's so much part of our lexicon. We know how to pronounce it because we've heard it. It's COVID, not COVID. But that's also because we know how to read words like tiger. We wouldn't say tigger. I saw a tigger, unless it was Winnie the Pooh, perhaps. Oops, what happened there? Oh, whoops, now I remember. Okay, Dr. Crystal, this is
Yes.
to prove a quick experiment here. Can you read the words on the screen for me, please?
Blute, 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 blute.
Yes. So that's not a word that's in English, but you used your your phonics knowledge. You probably saw something like the word lute,
Mhm.
and you know that it's the oo sound. And so your brain, within a portion of a second, decoded this word, even though you'd never seen it before. And what's even more amazing is you read it in lowercase, uppercase, green, any color for that matter, and cursive, which all goes to show that the old idea that we learned words by the shape is not true. Once you've decoded a word, you can read it even if it's written in, scroll. Okay, now if I've got this right, I'm going to show you a first grade sentence, okay? Can you read that for me?
No.
No. Why? Because you don't know the
I don't know the language.
You don't know the language, you don't know the code, right? You don't
Yes,
know
the
how to
code.
even
Yeah,
approach it. You don't even know what's a word and what's a sound. You don't know.
right.
But if you knew that code, it would be fine. I'm going to give you a little hint. Do you want to make a
Cat.
guess? Yeah, this is a cat in Mandarin Chinese. If you
Wow.
were a first grader in China, you would be able to read that. But it's because you don't know that code. But once you've got the code, you're good. Okay, so remember earlier we talked about the sound boxes for hat?
Yeah.
When you're connecting with the phonics, now you've got your little letter cards or you've got your magnetic letters, and now kids are putting the letters into the sound. H, a, t. And so those kindergartners and first graders are starting to build those words and see those patterns and internalizing and building that orthographic lexicon. It's also important that we teach, of course, a lot of the spelling rules. And English, as I told you, is a very opaque language, not easy at all. And while this is typically the role of kindergarten, first, second grade teachers, all content teachers can help kids with spelling, because you are going to have kids even in high school who are poor readers because they probably went through balanced literacy, or you're going to have students who are English as a second language. So knowing some of these rules can be helpful. Now, of course, there are like 200 rules, but here's one that you might know. You might know it, but might not know it as a rule. So it's called the floss rule, and there's a little dental floss to help as a visual reminder. But when a one-syllable word ends with a f, l, s, or z, we double the consonant. No words end with just one f. So we always have two f's, like in puff, cliff, sniff, stuff. We always have two l's, ball, pill, doll, hill, doll, or Jill, my name. Two s's, kiss, miss, guess, boss, less, and two z's, buzz, jazz, fuzz, and fizz. So it's just a little thing. And if you perhaps encountered a student who is not spelling a word correctly, you could perhaps figure out the spelling rule. It's hard when you've not learned them directly. And we just know if you wrote the word puff, P-U-F, you would just know that you need two F's. But what is the rule? You can look these up to help kids. So, oh, sorry, Dean, this was for you.
The next question, Jill, is how does structure literacy look in the upper elementary grades?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, in the lower elementary grades, the focus is very much on phonics and phonemic awareness, but while building that rich vocabulary. When you get up into third, fourth, fifth grade, you continue to fill gaps. There are going to be kids that still are having trouble with things, and it's really important that we assess and make sure we know where the deficits are, because we can fill those gaps in foundational literacy. But now the focus is going to switch to morphology. And just as we were mentioning earlier, because when the kids hit third grade and fourth grade, they are now starting to learn really big academic words in whatever content area, whatever. So you can't break apart a big multisyllabic word, as I mentioned, if you can't read the individual syllables. So now we're really building these words, and this is where all teachers can help. Content teachers can help these kids break apart these big words, pronounce them, and understand them. And understanding morphology can really help with this. So we want the kids to be able to decode quickly and automatically, because that frees their brain up to comprehend. If they are looking at these big words and they are so focused, let's look at the bottom, the word condensation. If they are going shin, they've lost the meaning of the word and they've lost the meaning of the passage. So we want them to read really quickly and comprehend. So poor decoders have poor comprehension. So in that case, hopefully the classroom teacher is helping them with decoding, but as a content teacher, you can do that too. So what comes now into play is understanding affixes, which are prefixes and suffixes, and those root words, because a lot of our academic words come from Greek and Latin. And those base words, once you learn some of those words, that helps you become an independent word learner. The teacher doesn't have time to teach you every word, but if you know what the base word is and you know what the prefix is, you can start figuring it out on your own. So morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning. So it has a meaning. And Also, once you've learned to decode a lot of these words, it also helps you learn how to write these words, because reading and writing are reciprocal. So that we can be teaching kids big words like condensation, and they can be writing big words like condensation. So morphology is the study of word forms, morph meaning a form or shape, and ology, the study of, like biology. And the base word, in this case morph, can be either a free base or a bound base. A free base means it's a word that stands on its own. So a word like help is a morpheme. It has a meaning. It's free. You can just use the word help, or you can say helpful or unhelpful. You can build that word up with affixes, prefixes, and suffixes. There are two types of morphemes in a suffix that can change it. One is if we put like an S on the word boy, it changes it from a singular boy to plural boys. They can change the verb tense. I jump, I jumped. Now we're talking about past tense. And it can make a comparison, like biggest. All of those are morphemes. They're not words. They're bound. They're bound to another word, so they're not a free morpheme. And a derivational morpheme can make a whole new word. So happy, and now unhappy has a whole different meaning. So not the same. It's now changed the meaning completely. So think about the word teach. Okay, Dr. Crystal, how many
Yeah.
words could you think of if you added suffixes and prefixes? Can you think of 2 or 3 other words?
Oh, teacher, teaching, and then adding plural like teachers and teachings as well.
True, you just added 2 morphemes there.
Yes.
Unteachable. I mean, there's
Yeah.
just so many. So
Right.
when you know a base word and you know what these affixes mean, and if someone says, "Well, that kid is really unteachable," a student should be able to figure that out, because they know "un" means not. They know what "teach" means, and able to be taught, unable to be taught. So it helps students develop their vocabulary. So here are some common prefixes and suffixes. There are so many of them, but just imagine if you're teaching something in science with biology, there's a great chance to talk about that prefix bio. What does it mean? If you're talking about microscopes in science, you could talk about how micro means small. What are some other words that we know that have micro? Microwave, for example. I was in a math class, and the teacher was teaching triangles. And I thought, well, wow, that would have been a great time for her to say tri means 3. So a triangle will have 3 lines, 3, what's the word? 3 sides.
Angles.
But then what's another word that has tri? Like tripod, tricycle. So just making those quick little additions to your lesson can really help the students build their vocabulary. And then at the end, we have these suffixes that change words. For example, slow to slowly, educate to education. These are what we call our like stable suffixes that can change word form. And we can talk about how educate is a verb, but if we put the shun at the end, now it's a noun. So just something you can talk quickly when you're doing vocabulary. Then there are all these base words or root words. And again, if you're talking about a new word that you're teaching, and you can see, okay, oh, here we go. Here's a word with cardi, like cardiologist, cardio. What are some other words that might have cardi in them? So you can use it to really help students gain better word knowledge. Okay, here's a word, symmetrical. And this is adapted from William Van Cleve, who does really great presentations on morphology. Thanks to him. So first of all, like, how many syllables do you hear in the word symmetrical? So we could pretend you're teaching something symmetrical in your math class. So you're going to just do a little vocab work with your students. So Dr. Crystal, how many in
Oh my
symmetrical?
gosh. Now you're putting me, this is hard. I would guess 5.
4.
4.
Symmetrical.
Okay.
Yeah, 4. Close enough. But this is something good to do with the students. And it's fine if you even have to tell your kids, I've got to think about it. And now, this is a hard one. I won't make you guess. How many morphemes? So I won't make you do that
Okay.
because we haven't talked enough about it. And what about its origin? Do you want to make a guess to the origin of the word?
So, well, metric.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's
It's
yeah. I'm not sure. So,
okay. Don't worry, I'll
yeah.
tell you. Okay, here are the morphemes. So this word
Okay.
actually has four morphemes: sim, met,
Right.
ick, and l. And I'm going to
Okay.
tell you what they mean in just a minute. Sim is a morpheme. It has a meaning that means same or together,
Yeah.
like symbol. Metra means meter or measure. Ick tells me it's an adjective, and all also it's an adjective. So if you were teaching this word, you could say, look, this word symmetrical has that met, but now look at some other words that have that: geometrical, isometric, biometric, metronome. So you can make a connection from music to math. Um, these words are going to be handy across all content areas. And then if you had that prefix sim, that can also be spelled with an SYN or SYL, you can tell your students it'd be like sympathy or symptom or synonym or symbol. Okay, whoops, rushed along there.
Okay. Next question, Jill, is does structure literacy fit into the MTSS, and what do the tiers look like? I remember you mentioned that earlier that you were going to go over this. So here's the question.
Okay. So we do have a tiered model of instruction in our schools. And if you're already in schools, you'll know about this. So first of all, we had what was called response to intervention, or RTI. And that's actually a term that's still used a lot, especially in Ohio. It was really more a response to intervention for literacy. If kids were not learning how to read, what was the next step, and what was the next step to help them acquire literacy? Now that has been broadened to the multi-tier system of support, MTSS. It's a much broader umbrella, so it includes academics, kids who need additional support in academics, but also in social emotional learning, attendance, and behavior. And in fact, it's even kind of becoming even more broad. So there are some kids who are going to be, with just normal classroom routines and rules, behavior will be fine. There's going to be some kids who are going to need some additional intervention, and some kids that are going to need even more. So every school should have an MTSS team, maybe still called an RTI team or intervention team, that review data and determine if additional supports are needed. So let's see what that's An MTSS in Ohio, typically we think of it as leading to special ed. If a student is not doing well in the regular classroom, they get extra help, and then go into special ed. But not necessarily. There are just some kids who are going to need some extra help. So here's what it looks like. The first tier is your core instruction in the classroom. So it's differentiated instruction using universal design for learning. And this instruction should help 80%. 80% of kids should benefit from your tier one instruction. Good tier one. Then there's going to be about 15% of students who are going to need a little more support. And they're going to move into tier two. And tier two is that targeted small group instruction, typically done by the classroom teacher. It could also be a reading teacher or someone else, where they get pulled aside maybe for 30 minutes a week during reading group or whatever, and they're getting their very targeted instruction. So typically there's a decision made that we're going to try giving them this extra help for, say, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks. And we are always progress monitoring, and it could be that that's all they need to catch up. There might have been some gaps, they could go back. However, there are going to be some students, up to 5%, who are going to need that very intensive individual intervention, often with an intervention specialist. And these students may, not always, but they may need evaluation for special ed. So the whole idea is that the children get what they need. And schools have different names for it. Some Columbus schools call it the WIN program, What I Need, WIN. Others call it the MTSS time. People call it intervention time. So you might hear all of these things.
Jill,
So
could I just stop you there? Because of the project that you and I are involved in, how about students who are older? Let's say they're 10, 11 years old, English as a second language. They come in from another country where they never learned English. Where do they fit in this tiers of support?
Yes, so I will talk about that, but just briefly, they should
Okay.
still get tier one instruction in their classroom. However, they're going to be pulled out and get ESL services, hopefully. And ESL services is part of tier one. Being an English learner is not any kind of a disability. English learners just don't know English. If Dr. Crystal, you were suddenly finding yourself in the middle of Vietnam, it's not that you don't know anything, you just don't know Vietnamese.
Right.
Otherwise you've got all you've got all your normal abilities. So we don't want to think of English speakers as having a deficit. What they need is English instruction. So they should be in the core classroom getting their core subjects, but in addition, they should be getting that English language support. Now they're going to have to catch up quickly, so you're going to have to hope that they get that really good ESL support and classroom support. So that's where classroom teachers, knowing about how students learn to read, can help that new student who's perhaps fifth grade, just arrived. How are you going to help that child in your math class, your music class, your art class, or whatever? Because we are all responsible for the language development of our students. Even if you are a math teacher, you are teaching the language of math. If you're a science teacher, you're teaching the language of science, the vocabulary, how to write a science report. So this is important. And I'll come back to ELs in just a minute too.
Okay. Okay. Does structured literacy benefit students with disabilities?
My answer is simple. Yes, absolutely. So students with disabilities really benefit greatly from instruction that is very systematic, very sequential, and very explicit. So this actually benefits them greatly because they need a lot of repetition. So here we look at Nancy Young's ladder of reading, and this helps us understand why it's so good. So there are at the top here about 5% of kids who just seem to learn to read effortlessly. And according to my mom, I was one of them. I was the oldest of five, and I think I just kind of figured it out because mom was too busy with the other children. So apparently I went to school and they bumped me up to the next grade. But that's just some kids. But what I was doing was I had sort of taught myself how to decode. Then about 35% of kids are going to learn to read with any kind of instruction. So under balanced literacy, they did learn to read. It looked like they were doing fine. But then you've got this big 40 to 50%, they will learn to read as long as they have that very explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction. And I will say, one of my brothers and one of my sisters, this would be them. They did not get that. And it wasn't until they got some extra reading help that they learned about the sounds. They'd missed stuff and they hadn't made that connection. And then the bottom 10 to 15% of kids could be possibly dyslexic or have learning disabilities. And they really need this very explicit instruction with a lot of repetitions. So this whole structured literacy approach will be absolutely essential for these students, but it won't hurt the top students. If those students already figured out the things, yes, they will still be part of the classroom instruction, but then there'll be small group work that will move them ahead. But for those special ed kids, absolutely. Whether they get it from the classroom teacher and or the instructional specialist, intervention specialist.
And coming back to my question, my earlier question and comment, do English learners benefit from structured literacy?
And my answer again is yes. And this is exactly how I taught my English learners. However, it's been very controversial. For the last few years, there's been way too much emphasis on the phonics part, the bottom part of that reading rope. And that led many groups to dismiss science of reading. They said, no, it's not good for ELs, because I was going into classrooms and I was seeing the kids were just getting worksheet after worksheet after worksheet of phonics. So, for example, they were given a worksheet that said, color all the things that begin with the letter M. They didn't know what the pictures were. They didn't know that this thing was a mop. They didn't know that that picture of a lady was a mother. So they just colored all the pictures. So what was missing was the focus had unfortunately shifted too much to phonics. But if you look at the whole reading rope, it is absolutely perfect for ELs. So there was a big meeting last year, in 23, between the National Committee on Effective Literacy and the Reading League. Apparently somewhat contentious, but they came out with an agreement, with an understanding that science of reading has been misunderstood for ELs by some people, but that ELs definitely do need all aspects of the reading rope, and especially that language comprehension. So we always have to be thinking about the oral language piece. Okay.
And what are additional considerations for English learners in literacy instruction?
Yes. So our English learners are kind of a special group. They will enter US schools at all grade levels. So they could enter in kindergarten with no English, even if they were born in this country, they could still. They could enter at 8th grade or 12th grade with no English. So they missed the time when teachers are teaching all that very basic foundational literacy. So now they've got this double burden of having to learn language and content. Some of the students will come with literacy in their first language. And if you've already learned to read in one language, it's a lot easier to learn to read in another language, especially if they both use the alphabet. A little more difficult if they're from China or Thailand, for example. But then at least they have the idea of what literacy is. But you can still learn to read for the first time in English. So if they're learning to read in English for the first time, it's just going to take longer because we're going to have to go back through all of those letter sounds, spelling rules, building up those words. So as I mentioned, they're acquiring oral English at the same time as they're learning to read. When you think about an American child like my granddaughter, she started kindergarten with already, 9,000 words in her vocabulary. She can talk and understand. So now her job is starting to connect those to the sounds. But our English learners are coming in without even oral English. So it's so important because we learn to read from speech to print. We have to know that oral language first. So they have that double burden, as I mentioned, of having to learn the language, English, at the same time they're learning that content, maybe even high-level content like 8th grade math, but they don't have enough English. However, they've still got their 8th grade brains. They can still learn, and some of them are highly educated from their own country. We just have to try to help them get their reading up to the point where they can help. But we can do a lot through translation, a lot through visuals, and other things. So because our ELs have limited time, you think about an EL who enters a middle or high school, they still have to meet the graduation requirements. There is no exception. They have to meet the graduation, one of the pathways. So therefore, we have to be really consistent, coherent, and coordinated in the literacy approach. You don't want one teacher doing one thing and another teacher doing another thing, and these poor ELs are all over the place. We need to have a very consistent view. So work with your ESL teachers and, see what they're learning in their ESL class, and then what can you do in your, for example, science class that could help the students gain that oral language or that literacy. So here's a quick little experiment, Dr. Bristol. So the ability to read in one language will make it easier for you to read in another language. So would you like to try reading that first sentence for me?
Oh boy. Ko e a ho he any.
Ah, almost. Koe aho ha eni. So you were able to decode it because you used what you knew from English, right? And it's using an alphabet. There might be a slight difference, but you could read it. Now, what does it mean?
I have no idea.
Right. So that's like our ESL kids. They can sometimes learn how to decode and they can sound okay, but they don't know what they mean. So just because they can read doesn't mean they necessarily know. Okay, can you try the second sentence, please?
Je ne comprende pas.
Close. Do you know the language?
No.
That's French. Oh, I forgot to tell you.
I do. Yes, I do know the language, but I don't speak the language.
Okay, well, the first one I didn't tell you. It just says what day is today, and it's in a Polynesian language called Tonga, which is where I did my Peace Corps teaching. The second one is a French sentence. It says, I don't understand. And here is a word, we call these a cognate, because it looks like the word comprehend. So if you were a student and you saw, oh, comprehend, okay, you could sort of now starting to get an idea that this could be something similar. And there's a lot of words between Spanish and English, French and English, German and English that sound kind of the same. So we can build on those. Okay, would you like to try the third one?
The alpistu.
Ah, very well. Do you know what that one means?
What year is it? Or no?
Close, close.
Yeah. What is it?
How
What is,
old are
how
you?
old are you? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And what language?
German.
German, yes. You can see it's kind of got a direct correlation with our grammar. How old are you?
You. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. And then Alt, if you've been to Germany, you might have been like to the Alt Stadt, the old town. So, you can sort of see how
Oh,
there's
yeah.
connections there. Now, I'm not even going to ask you to
It
try
looks
the
like
last one.
it looks like a Southeast Asian um, language, Thai, something like that.
Yes, it's Thai. And it's what is it fun? It's just a question. Is it fun? You wouldn't even know it was a question, but the Wie bist du has a question mark, so that can help. So that shows that you can transfer, if you have an alphabetic language, you can transfer quite a lot, and we can build on that. So as I mentioned, students learn to read from speech to print, and now we like to say that text floats on an ocean of talk. So when we're working with our English learners, we have to add that oral language. We have to help them learn the oral language before they get to the print part. I mean, you can do it quickly. It doesn't mean you don't present print to them, but we talk about things and then we read the text and then we write something. But we don't want to just tell them, okay, pick up your pencil and write, because they don't know what to write. So for phonics and phonemic awareness for our ELs, some phonemes are going to transfer. Some of a B might be a B in lots of languages. But there are, as I mentioned, 44 phonemes in English, and some of them don't exist in many other languages. And one of them is the TH is very hard for a lot of immigrants to make. And that might be something, if you're teaching a word, is to help the students pronounce it and help them spell it. There's a chance to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, Spanish has only 23 phonemes. When we're teaching students sounds, make sure you show the mouth. So if I'm doing that TH, I'm going to be right up now without a mask these days and actually show them how I do that TH. I'm going to stick my tongue and have them see my mouth position. I do like to add visuals. Remember way back when we did the word hat? I actually had a little picture of a hat. Otherwise, we're just asking students to do phonemic awareness with a word they don't know. Some students, like the student from Thailand, they may not even know how to form the English letters. And that's something they'll be learning in ESL, but you can help also. And as I said, spelling patterns, they'll need help with that. And then when it comes to fluency for ELs, often our ELs get so caught up on like sounding out each word that they don't get that nice fluent sentence. And fluency helps with comprehension. So if you're so focused on reading something, you miss the whole idea of it. So what we need to do is a lot of modeling. So you, as a content area teacher, you could read the first sentence or the first paragraph. And that way you're modeling it, reading it at a natural but not too fast pace. You want to kind of slow it down a little bit so they can hear it. Using audiobooks, videos, letting them hear that language. Repeated reading is really good, but with support, like having them read that same paragraph over and over. But we don't want them to read it incorrectly, so we do need to add that support. Once they're starting to read more fluently, then if there's a mistake, encourage them to self-correct. Go back. Does that sound right? Try again. And when you give feedback, you want to make sure it's explicit. Don't just say like, oh, good work. That doesn't tell a student anything. Tell them now, go back to this word. I want you to try it again. Say it now with a long E sound. Okay, now they got it. Choral reading is when you, the teacher, and the students all read together. So for an EL, that kind of helps because even if they can't read, they can listen. And echo read is when you or a fluent reader reads a sentence and then the students read the sentence. So they've got you as a model. Partner reading with a fluent reader. And remember too, for our older students, they will always have an accent. I mean, I've lived here my adult life and I still have my New Zealand accent. Accent is not important. The main thing is, can you understand? Now, if the accent is such that it's very hard to understand, then we will obviously have to try to help students, but it can be hard. So here's just a little hint of things to do with ELs is when you're reading a text, think about what you can do before, or it could even be watching a video or something else, before, during, and after. So before you read the text, help the students. You don't have to do all of these, but some of these. Like, what is the purpose? What are we going to read about? Let's predict what this might be about. Here's some vocabulary words you're going to read about in this text about the Civil War, for example. So pull out some vocabulary. So if they have that already taught to them, it'll be easier. Do they need background information? Maybe they don't even know what the Civil War was. Could you find a video in their language or even in English that they could at least understand what the Civil War was? So videos you can put on the captions, or there are videos you can actually change the captions to other languages. Using the first language, L1 means the first language. Maybe find something in the first language. You could do a chapter walk where you walk through the chapter and talk about the different parts, create questions, or make a know, want to know, learn to chart. Then during the reading, stop and chunk the learning. It'll be good for all kids, or you could pull a small group of English learners and struggling learners aside and figure out, okay, we might read it paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence. We might do some oral reading together. We might have the kids fill out graphic organizers so that they can show how much they know. Stop and explain vocabulary. Some words you want to describe best in just right there in the story or in the text. Having them annotate, maybe what they have questions. They don't know what this word means. Shared note-taking with an EL and a non-EL. They could take notes together. A sentence study is where you pull a sentence out of a text and you really study that sentence. You talk about the different parts of it. What does it mean? The vocabulary, the grammar, etc. And sketch notes are where you have students, as they're listening or writing, they draw little pictures to help them remember. And that's really good for ELs because maybe they can't write enough, but they can show you, they understand, they can show you because they drew a picture. And then, of course, afterwards, you have to find out, do they understand what they read? And then here are a list of things that they could do to show they understand. So that brings me to the end. Do you have any final questions?
Well, I certainly, and I've heard you, Jill, speak a lot at meetings and such, and I just learned so much today that and just by listening to you, I think back to my days as a high school and middle school teacher, and I worked with ELs, and some of these kids just had no idea what was happening, and I just never knew what to do. And I wish I was teaching now because I certainly do those kids because I feel like I don't want to say failed them, but I feel that I certainly could have helped them certainly with this knowledge. And so I just want to say thank you personally, and just thank you for all the listeners who will be listening to this talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.